Welcome to Behind the Build. I'm your host, Jonathan Jacobs, and today I have someone different on. While we have normally had architects and designers on, taking a slightly different approach on some of our upcoming guests, not always, but sometimes. And so today I have with me David Hine. David Hine is an engineer who is also a building code and fire protection consultant. So David, thank you for joining.
Thank you.
Before going into the depths of today's episode, I want to bring forward Kaplan's Appliances, one of our strategic partners in sponsorship for the podcast. Kaplan's was founded in 1944. That is over 80 years of customer service for clients in and around Toronto, Canada. Think about that really for a minute. In 80 years, think about what's happened with appliances and how much they've changed, and now the importance of what customer service means to our clientele. Finding suitable products for a client, ensuring that we understand what they need for freezer space, fridge space. Where are they going to put their wine? Is it going to be panel ready? Is it not? Kaplan's has a wide array of products available for you and your clients. So if you're interested in learning more about them, I would be happy to connect you. You'll be able to gain product knowledge on Sub-Zero, Wolf, Miele, Genair, Fisher-Paykel. If you're looking for outdoor, well, it could be Lynx, it could be Kalamazoo. Feel free to email me, Jonathan, that's Jonathan, at waldenhomes.ca, and I would be happy to connect you with an in-store manager that will look to understand what your needs are to connect you with the right sales rep for your clients. And now, back to the episode. I was introduced to David through a good friend of his, a longtime professional acquaintance, and that is Michael Taylor from Taylor Smythe. And the beauty of this introduction is that in what we do at Walden, we are constantly met with inspectors and having to adhere to code, and that's what our partners are always having to adhere to, and back and forth with examiners and moving up the chain. So I thought one of the nice benefits of being able to have you on was to be able to help educate some people on what you as a consultant would do and what you've seen over the years, and just kind of tap into all of that. But obviously, as I always do, start from the beginning.
Start from the beginning of fire protection in Canada. It started many, many years ago with a company called Rolf Jensen as a result of a fire that took place in the United States, the Beverly Hills Supper Club fire, where a huge number of people were killed, and it was Rolf Jensen was asked to investigate it. And it turned out that the building had various cladding that was problems, interior finishes that were problems. And basically the government said this should never happen again. And that was the genesis for starting fire protection engineering in the United States.
Interesting.
And
in 1912?
No, that was the 1960s, 1970s.
Oh, okay.
So it was quite recent.
Oh, okay.
And that spurred on the consulting industry, the building code consulting industry, who was able then to help architects understand the ever strengthening codes for life and fire safety. And our codes have sort of evolved again to address more important issues, not to suggest life and fire safety aren't important, but the health and the accessibility of our buildings. Because, 20, 30 years ago, people who had mobility issues, hearing issues, visibility issues or sight issues, we're finding it difficult to navigate buildings.
Interesting.
And
Yeah.
so now barrier-free accessibility is a huge thing and a respectful thing to say, welcome to our built environment.
Yeah.
And part of the dilemma is trying to make those buildings as safe as a person who is able-bodied and to evacuate. And that's where our code is becoming a little bit more humanizing, where it says architecture should never, ever be the form of expression of discrimination. And our buildings did do that because the doors weren't wide enough, or there was a set of stairs, which makes it impossible for a person who has barrier-free needs in a wheelchair to gain access to it, or a walker. But now that we're finding, doors that have power door operators, during COVID, that's how we opened doors, right?
Yeah.
But
all the retrofitting that was happening.
and so that accelerated some of the attitude towards making it buildings more usable. Obviously, our government buildings are all now barrier-free accessible. Our buildings are now being built so that there is an accessibility. So, if you live in an apartment building and you have a child or a parent, they can generally get to the suite. Now, the suite might be a different issue, but the codes haven't mandated that in all situations.
Right.
But it's reflecting the needs of people as our buildings are constructed. Now, it does become challenging for existing buildings, but our newer buildings are becoming so much more livable for those who present themselves differently than a person who can walk.
Yeah,
I'm not sure what the right way to say it.
I was going to say, like, well, you qualify as a standard being. I mean, I don't even know what that. Yeah, maybe that's not even correct.
Yeah.
So you know what? Maybe I'll retract that.
I think
able body.
I think everybody is able-bodied, right?
So maybe we're not going to call them. They're not going to be handicapped. They're not going to be standard. There's happening is the Paralympics, right? Now I know that this is going to air later than when the Paralympics are on, but that's, I guess, what is the safe term to call it.
Yeah. And that, as our buildings have become more usable by all, it's an acknowledgement that, just because you're missing a limb doesn't prohibit you from being able to work.
Right.
Whereas I think, in earlier times, we used to not think that they were able. So our buildings are becoming more livable for everyone. And that's one of the things that I do emphasize whenever I do consulting, is that you can't express your form of discrimination through architecture. So a person who has barrier-free needs, who's in a wheelchair, they have to be able to get into your building and they have to be able to use it. Whether you agree with me or not, just don't use architecture. Like, you can think it, and you can be a racist. Not that I'm suggesting any of my clients are, but there have been barriers.
Yeah.
Throughout history.
You could have whatever thoughts are in your mind about other people.
Yeah.
But you cannot express it through what you're going to design.
Yeah. And you can't do it through signage. You can't put a sign to say no tall people allowed, right? And that's essentially what is, unfortunately, sometimes when I have discussions with my clients and they start grumbling about the barrier-free needs, I said, well, then why don't you just put a sign up at the top of your building to say, no, you fill in the blank, type people allowed, whether it's tall people, short people, people in wheelchairs. If you put that sign on the front of your building, you will get people protesting. Yeah,
what's interesting, as you say, this is obviously there's a lot of delicate talk about how you classify almost anyone nowadays. What I'm curious to know about is, you've entered into this field. Was there why? Why did you enter this field? Like, at what stage of your life you say to yourself, I'm going to become a building code consultant?
It was one of those things. I've got my engineering degree from McMaster University. And, as you stumble towards a career, there's a couple things. I like fires. In a strange
okay,
way.
You arsonist.
Well, let's not go down that one. I never got caught. But it's...
Wait, hold on. Just to clarify, he is not an arsonist and we're making jokes. He's a code consultant. Just got to say it, because I don't know how people interpret things.
Yeah, well, that's true. People can interpret things in a variety of different ways.
So
in university, you never really learn about the rules. You learn about theory of this and that. And then when I got into working at a building department, I realized that there was certain rules of construction. And I guess my upbringing is such that there's rules and you have to follow the rules. And being the youngest son, I think I chose a different path of, there's rules, but then I don't disagree with the rules, double negatives, meaning I agree with the rules. But every rule that has ever been written, there are exceptions. You just have to find them.
Right.
And I think of, some that are pretty fundamental to many religions, is the one that says thou shalt not kill, right? That's pretty fundamental to everyone in the world. But there are times when that might be a necessity. Mm-hmm. Your government may say to you as a soldier, go over there to do something.
Yep.
Or if you come home one day and you find something going on in your house that's not acceptable. And
not in Canada.
Not in Canada. But if something were to happen and you come home and you see violence being placed on a family member, And the only way to solve that problem is through deadly force. Thou shalt not kill. So but you have to, in order to either follow the rules, the direction of your government, or follow your heart in protecting a family member.
Right.
So, that's to me is the genesis of just about every rule. So you can't do that. Well, yeah, you can. You just have to figure out how or where in the codes, the building codes, coming back to the building codes, as to why it's telling you can't do it. And if you were to modify that input, is there a possibility for you to do it? And I think a great example is the OCAD building, the Ontario College of Art and Design building on McCall Street in Toronto, which is that it looks like a tabletop above the existing building. And the architect, Greg Woods, he and I decided very early on the stage in the consulting of that this is a weird building and we don't deserve to have normal thoughts. So what we decided to do.
In fairness, I'm going to say this. Now, having known you for an hour, I will say that I don't know that you have standard thoughts anyways.
Well, that's probably fairly true. But normally when you have a building, you sit there in your pre-COVID days, you sit in a meeting where there's, somebody that's going to demonstrate a set of drawings and as the consultant, you're going to look at it. And Greg and I weren't into that. We both said, well, let's meet in a bar. And so what we would do is when we met in a bar.
So interesting where you're going with this.
The first beer, it was great. It's lovely, comforting. And then that sort of sets your mind a little bit free, right? After the second beer, your mind's pretty free. Third beer, you're starting to go, not good. So it's that sweet spot on the second beer that allowed Greg to come up with some of these fabulous ideas for the building. He and Will Alsop from the United States worked on it, where we came up with some concepts on how to get this building designed and designed on budget, where we looked at some of the code issues and said, well, that doesn't really make a lot of sense here. Let's look at this building a little differently.
Right.
And sometimes it's just almost, if you can turn, the building code is a document that's a lot of black letters on white paper, but you have to read what's not written. And you also have to read what's behind that, the black letters, and read that white stuff. And it's, once you start to understand that, the building code is a really powerful and it's a wonderful document. And there's all sorts of possibilities once you understand the intimacies of it. And an example of that is if I was to say to you, only people who are wearing baseball caps are really smart, right? Well, I've said two things. I've said people who wear baseball caps are really smart, but I've also said people who don't wear baseball caps are not as smart as people who wear baseball caps.
But you also haven't quantified your definition of smart.
I have not. But the interesting thing is I've told you two things.
Yeah.
By simply saying one sentence, right? And that's what the building code does. It tells you a whole bunch of stuff you can't do. But if your mindset is so negative that you can think of only the things you can't do, you start to lose track of the beautiful stuff that you can do.
Right.
And that's where building code consultants, that started way back when with Rolf Jansen back in the 70s or the 60s, that has picked up momentum where the more you know about the building code, the more your designs can become interesting. And so most major construction projects, no, I would say all construction projects, all condos, most relatively large buildings, anything over 3 stories, typically has a building code consultant. And so we're just another layer that the architect can use in order to design a really interesting building, if they want to design a really interesting building.
So what led you away from working for municipalities or the cities of wherever you were into a consulting role?
Well, when I started off at a small town north of the city, and then I ended up working at the city of Scarborough when it was the city of Scarborough, not the city of Toronto before amalgamation.
Yeah.
And as part of the pay grade as a civic employee, the more you knew, the better educated you were, that would influence your salary. And so I took a course at Seneca College, and I met a really interesting gentleman, and whose name temporarily escapes me. And he was on, pardon me?
So that's an interesting name.
It makes it easy to remember. So he was into special extinguishing systems, which
Right.
were kitchen suppression systems. Halon was a big product back then because it was a fabulous.
And what is that? What's
Halon?
Yeah.
Halon is a gas that has been banned because it has ozone depleting chemicals in it that helped create the hole in the ozone.
Got it.
So back in, I don't know, there was a protocol that the world said we're not going to use halon anymore, which is devastating to the fire protection industry, but they generated a whole bunch of other fire protection gases.
Right.
So, and what happened from taking that course, it inspired me to say, this is a really cool industry to be in, this fire protection building code skill set. And when you're working for a municipality, you need to know an awful lot, but you're only looking for non-compliant issues. You never give an architect, oh, that's a great design. You're always having to find mistakes because that's what your role is. You think the architects are trying to slip something by you or that architects are
Right.
not knowledgeable in the building code, so we're going to catch them.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's this perceived cat and mouse game when most architects, they do their darndest to comply with the building codes because if they comply with the building codes, they don't have to redesign, right? So the more compliant they are, the less time you spend through the building permit process.
Of course.
But architects make mistakes, engineers make mistakes. We're all human. We make mistakes.
Yeah.
And the filter of the building department is that they often catch those mistakes before it gets built or before it becomes a problem. So everybody has their role in the design of a building, including building officials. And if the building official misses it, then it gets starts to be constructed, and hopefully the building inspector will catch it. By that time, though, it's a problem because you're building a building that has a known problem. Now you have to undo stuff to correct it. That happens. We're all human. We all make mistakes. It's just it's the methodology of how you react to that. And sometimes code consultants can look at something and say, well, if you look at this differently, the outcome might be the same, but it's just almost rephrasing what you call it.
Interesting.
So a building code consultant can really help not only the design, sometimes through construction, sometimes during construction, and at the end of the project to make sure everything is generally in compliance with the code. It's a great field to be in. There's lots of great firms out there.
Yeah, I feel like there's endless amounts of work.
There's endless amounts of work because I think every architect should have a building code consultant
Agree.
that they can pick up the phone and say,
Yeah.
we're running into this problem and how do we solve it?
Yeah.
And we do that,
It should just have office space dedicated to a code consultant.
Well,
It'd be so interesting.
there are large enough architectural firms that have people that are really good in the building code.
Right.
They're not building code consultants, but it's really helpful to have that immediate access to say, am I allowed to do this?
Mm-hmm.
Now, the unique challenge to my job right now is the Ontario Building Code is undergoing a significant modification or change in direction in which there's 2,700 changes, and it's going to come into effect as of January 1st, which is the transition period to be fully enacted as of March 31st. So there's lots and lots of change coming.
Yeah, to unpack and understand.
And municipalities are in the same problem as architects where they're not understanding what these changes are.
Right.
And even the building code consultants, we're not up to speed as to where all those changes are. It's a monumental task that the Ministry of Housing has done in order to harmonize our codes in closer alignment with the National Building Code. But it is a monumental task for everyone. And come January 1st, I'm going to think there's going to be a huge spike of building permits between January 1st and March 31st so that we can use the old code.
Right.
And then as of March 31st, building permit applications are going to drop as architects try to get up to speed as to what those changes are.
Yeah. As you say that, I'm just thinking about also, is it not also based on when you have an approval of your code to when you construct that the new code can take effect?
It's from date of permit application.
Okay.
So if you apply for a building permit today and it takes 8 years for a building permit to be issued, you're stuck with the code that's in place at the day of permit application.
Oh, interesting. Because
and that way it prevents the code from evolving you into non-compliance.
Right.
That's what everyone fears, is that, well, if I apply for my permit now and the permit's issued in 6 weeks or 10 weeks from now and the code changes, am I going to be non-compliant? No. That's why prior to that implemented date, you get this huge spike of permit applications. Right. And whether the new code would benefit those projects, most architects don't want to take that risk because codes generally don't get less restrictive.
Really?
Yeah, it's a surprise.
You know what? We're just going to free it up. Go ahead and build what you want.
Yeah.
I don't think so.
No.
I'm finding, I've been, I think, largely very quiet listening because I find this so interesting. It's a different conversation this time around. So, I'm going to go back. So you had increased your knowledge across various categories of code, which allows you to obviously earn more, but then you get to a stage where after working for the city or municipality, you say, bye.
I want more.
Yeah.
I want more. I want to be on the other side of the design world. I don't want to be checking. I want to be helping architects create that vision.
Yeah.
And, that's the beauty of it. You sit with an architect and you, at a very preliminary stage, and say, okay, so what do you want? I want a 4-story building. Okay, do you want to build it out of wood? Do you want to build it out of steel? Do you want to build it out of non-combustible? Do you want to use mass timber? Do you want to use encapsulated mass timber? What's the fabric of this building? What's the heart? And what are you going to do in it? And how do you want people to perceive this building? Like, if you want to design a box, you don't need a code consultant. But if you want something that has a heart or a sense of purpose, when you walk into a building, you want to be blown away by a feeling of whatever it is. Like when you go into a place of religion, you want to be blown away by that sanctuary of feeling that you're not, number one. There's somebody a little bit more important than you in the world, or outside of this world. When you go into a school of an educational building, you don't want to be stuck with a corridor, and you want to be inspired to learn more. A building is an inspiration. And that's where architects are really fabulous at creating that sense of overwhelming joy when you're in the building. And architects are able to do that and solicit that emotion through the use of materials and through the use of color. And that's what they're really good at. But when it comes to that initial, what do you want to design and what's your feel? Do you want to have a hole in the floor, right? Do you want to have a hole through 3 floors? Do you want to have an open stair? Do you want to have glass here? Once you start to flush that out with the architect, it's amazing what they can design in compliance with the building code.
Right. What have been some of the more complicated projects that you've been on? And this is an open-ended question that you may or may not feel you can or cannot answer. I don't know if you've had disclosure agreements or non-disclosure agreements, or
it's funny that I'm not a big fan of those. I'm just going to drift off on the non-disclosure.
Yeah.
I was asked by the handlers of a certain singer who now resides in Toronto if I would like to come meet with them so that they can show me their designs. They wanted to interview me, but they didn't want to pay for this interview, right? I'm a consultant. You pay me for my time. And they said, well, we're not going to pay you. So I basically said, go away. I'm not interested in working for you. And on top of it, you wanted me to sign a non-disclosure. I said, you're going to be submitting these for building permit.
Yeah.
Well, it's surprisingly about 2 weeks after I told them to pound salt, their drawings were on the internet, right? Anyway, the non-disclosure is a bit of a weird thing because all this information is public information.
It becomes public information. Yeah.
So the question was interesting projects.
Yeah. And look, and I also say that because I do understand the nature of our business. And there are times where there are clients who may or may not want their information out there. And sometimes in a situation of a home, for instance, it could be a company that owns the house. And so you don't know who the actual homeowner is. Yeah. Or it's in a spousal name and it's not the same as the person that wants the privacy.
Yeah.
So
there's been it's funny. I've worked on just about every type of building in Toronto and in Canada. One of the most spectacular houses I think I've ever worked on is Integral House that was done by Shim-Sutcliffe for a mathematician
Yes.
who made a lot of money through his sales of his books, his calculus and integrals and all that stuff.
Yeah.
Fabulous building. And Shim-Sutcliffe is a great architectural firm. And they designed this curvaceous building that, 2 stories above grade. And then there's 3 stories or 4 stories that fall down the ravine.
Yeah.
Fabulous building. That was one of the more challenging ones because of the curvaceousness of the exterior wall and how it relates to the property line. And we had to do some pretty interesting calculations to allow Shim-Sutcliffe to do what they wanted to do on that wall. It's a fabulous building.
And that project now is what? How many? Did you know? Is it 15 or 20 years old now?
It's got to be 20,
right? 20 years
20
old.
or 25 years old.
Yeah.
Now, yeah.
And it still holds up.
Yeah.
That house is on the market. I think it was like
it was
5 years ago, something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's a fabulous building.
Beautiful.
And
absolutely beautiful.
There's just, you have to obviously have a vision.
Yeah.
You obviously have to give that architect enough runway and enough money to be able to execute that vision. Right. And so they were able to do that. And that's a special building. It's a privately owned house that not many of us will ever have an opportunity to go into. Luckily, I was invited into it as part of the owner through a contractor and architectural team party.
Yeah.
And it was fabulous.
I have to say this, and I've actually never done this, and I've kind of chosen to not, stay quiet about it. But this is a scenario where I will say it. The podcast is powered by Walden Homes. I work at Walden Homes. I'm, chief project development. We build some pretty beautiful stuff. And I say this because you're describing what is, I think, one of the most iconic homes in Toronto. And to the detail and the architecture associated with what you've helped achieve and Shim-Sutcliffe has achieved, there's a lot of credit that I will say goes out to the builder. I won't mention, but I will say, who you are, and you did a very great job, and you have a great reputation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So I'll say that, because
yeah.
to achieve that house in construction is also a very, very, very strong testament to the abilities of the people involved.
Yeah.
So,
it is the team, right?
Totally.
The architect has the vision.
Yeah. Someone has to execute on it.
Someone has to execute it, and someone has to have that same vision, the same passion as the architect, because architects will tell, architects are storytellers through drawings.
Yes.
And I think that part of the other dilemma that I've encountered is that through the use of computers, architects are losing a little bit of that storytelling skill because they're abdicating a lot of the rendering to the computer, which then develops this vision.
There are a lot of people I've had on the podcast who still very much are in love with hand drawing.
Oh, absolutely.
And bringing those concepts to life in front of a client and the wow factor of what that looks like,
mm-hmm.
that they can then go ahead and turn over to a consultant like you and say, no, they're really excited. How do we do this?
Exactly. Or you sit with the architect with a blank piece of paper and a crayon or a marker, and you start doodling, right? And you end up with this mess. But then the architect goes away and he comes back and he turns this mess into, a floor plan. And you go, yeah, that's what we want.
So tell me, when you first started your practice, how was it trying to engage in conversations with the industry to be able to get your name out there and to start working on some of these projects, like, to work your way towards being a consultant on Integral House and OCAD and other places? Like, what did that look like?
I think I credit a lot of it to dumb luck and,
an engineer's dumb. Okay. Sure.
Dumb luck.
Sure.
I'm good at one thing, which is the building code. Don't ask me to solve the world's housing crisis. I've got some ideas on that, but from a building code perspective, I've been doing this for 35, 40 years. So you develop a client base.
Yep.
And having a consultant is somewhat, you're in a relationship with them. If you don't like them, get rid of them. If they don't support you when you're in crisis, get rid of them. It's not any different than any other relationship.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the people that I've always worked for have found that I get emotionally attached to their buildings, which is one thing I think is a strength. It's also a weakness. But you want to see that vision. And so the reputation that I've had is one of advocacy for good architecture, for the architecture that is being proposed.
Mm-hmm.
I don't have a problem in talking to building officials and suggesting that they're wrong. Again, they make mistakes, we make mistakes. And collaboratively, we have to work through it in order to identify problems so that we can resolve them. But I don't appreciate a building official who says, we need you to do the following without giving me a reference to the building code, a specific reference. And that's the thing that drives me crazy is in correspondence with building officials, they just say, it doesn't comply, you have to add another exit or you have to do the following. And you go, that's not the same conclusion I arrived at. So can you give me the basis for that? And then they get all upset because now you're asking them to do a bit more work and give you a code reference. And as I've expressed before, a code reference may or may not say what they're asking you to do. They may have interpreted it differently.
Mm-hmm.
And so fundamentally, always start with what the building code says when you have these discussions with building officials. But when how I developed all this client base was, I think I simply just did my job well. And my knowledge grew. I was respected enough to be asked to sit on a fire safety commission, which we adjudicated fire code related issues for the term, several terms. I did that for 11 years. I stay very current with the building code because I teach at Toronto Metropolitan University, continuing education program for new Canadians in the Ontario Building Code, right? So these people come to Canada, they're highly educated, they're motivated, and I get 25 of them, and they want to know about this building code, and they're a bit shell-shocked because they look at the thickness of the document and they go, we're never, ever going to understand this. And you just cajole and you beg and you work them hard for 13 weeks. At the end of it, they've got a pretty good fundamental of it, a fundamental understanding of the building code.
Right.
So that helps me stay current with the building code. So when someone asks me about a certain topic, it's just like being in school. I got to remember whereabouts it is. Oh yeah, it's right here in the code. And it's that skill, I guess, that I have that allows people to effectively use me. And then I can also say, well, if you looked at this building a little differently, you could do it this way and not have to do that, which I think a lot of architects are afraid of taking that leap.
Interesting. Yeah.
I had an example where a client of mine was renovating an existing building. His architect said, well, you got to do the following. I wasn't involved. And it turned out that the architect didn't give the owner any choices. And then when I got involved, unfortunately, I had to ruffle a few feathers by saying, if you looked at this from a different perspective, if you didn't have an occupant load of, I think we're at 300. I said, you're never going to get 300 people in this building. Honestly, you never will. And he goes, no, we'll have 50 at most. I said, well, then why are you doing this? And so it's, to me, when you look at the building code, it's a series of choices. And some of those choices the architect can make, some of those choices he or she should be confirming with their client to make sure that assumptions that they're making are correct.
Right.
And depending on those assumptions or those discussions you have with your client will result or could result in a totally different building.
I want to bring up another subject that you had talked about with me briefly, and that was a number of years ago, there were some changes to the code and they allowed for laneway suites in the city of Toronto.
Yes.
Can we touch on this subject?
Certainly.
Okay. You started smiling. I wasn't sure.
I smile and I grimace. Because laneway suites are secondary buildings on a property where there is a lane at the back of the property that provides access to a garage.
Right.
And there's also, along with that, there's garden suites. Garden suites are secondary buildings where there is no laneway.
Right.
So you have to walk between the buildings.
Which is similar to what we're in now.
Yes.
Similar to, but not.
Yes.
Themed.
So the laneway suite issue was one that I was involved in, where the city of Toronto has encouraged people to build these laneway suites to help increase or decrease the number of people looking for rental housing. It's a great attitude. Then
and a good initiative. Yeah. Yeah.
Good initiative, very expensive to build. So
really, you wouldn't believe, sorry, not to digress from where you're about to go. You would not believe the general public is astonished at the cost of building a laneway home. And we priced out a bunch of them through Walden, and making people aware of the fact that like you're still building another building, and it's an ancillary building, and you don't have any of the regular services that are going to the main building. So now you got to run all your services out there.
Yeah.
There are costs.
A lot of them.
And code.
And the building code.
Yes.
So we got involved in a project on Manning Street in which they were not able to get a building permit because the Toronto Building Department indicated that they were beyond a certain distance to a fire hydrant.
I apologize. I'm interrupting you. I'm going to call out someone here, and I'm going to say, Vanessa Fong, you will remember when we were looking at that project, and you and I were on a Zoom meeting, and we were looking at the location to the closest fire hydrant. There you go. Sorry. This was like the very beginning of this. Yeah. Vanessa, you'll remember.
So the city of Toronto said, well, you got to be within 90 meters of a fire hydrant. And the property on Manning, I think we were some other number. And the building department said, we can't issue you a building permit. And my question was, well, can you show me in the building code where it says that? And they showed me a very generic section in the appropriate part of the building code that said it's dependent on the abilities of the local fire service. And so they said, we can't issue you a building permit. I said, well, I don't understand this. 90 meters from a fire hydrant, are you suggesting that the fire department won't be able to put the fire out? They said, that's what our rule is. I said, but your rule is not, it's not legislative. So through the building code, you're allowed, if you disagree with a building official, you're allowed to go to what's called the Building Code Commission, which is a provincial tribunal where you get to say your piece and the municipality gets to say their piece. And the tribunal will judge the application on sufficiency of compliance, whether or not you achieve compliance.
This is beautiful.
And my problem with this whole notion of a fixed measurement to a fire hydrant is our Toronto firefighters, they have a budget of, I don't know, I think it's $700 million. And they can't apparently get to a fire hydrant that's beyond 90 meters. Yet the volunteer fire services that are, in Muskoka and Huntsville and all that, they typically don't have fire hydrants. Yet they're seemingly able to put out a structure fire efficiently, or maybe the place burns to the ground.
I was just saying they're carrying the water in their mouth.
They're doing something, but those firefighters, volunteer or not, are able to deal with that. The city of Toronto was unable to do that.
What's mind-blowing to me and what you just stated was that volunteer firefighters, most of these people in those rural areas have other jobs.
Yeah. Yeah. Or the building is on an island where there is no fire department access.
Right.
Yet in the city of Toronto, it had to be within 90 meters. And I'm still struggling with that. We were successful at the Building Code Commission. We had to give something. We ended up offering sprinklering the building which the commission then ruled in favor of us.
Right.
But you don't sprinkler your building up on cottage country, if 90 meters is the distance that a fire truck can go for a hydrant, and we were only talking about a laneway house. So the building in front of the laneway house is typically a 2 or 3 story house.
Yeah,
right?
It could be access. They could shoot over it.
Yeah, you shoot water over it with a water cannon, right? It frustrated me to no end to know that in a typical high-rise fire, the fire department is going to have to walk vertically up the stairs more than 30 meters or 40 meters or 90 meters, depending on the height of the building.
And is that where you drew upon the idea of putting a water sprinkling system into the structure? No,
I think that was just,
to give.
You have to give something to get something. And that was, but we were successful at the Code Commission, which then forced the fire department to reevaluate their position.
Oh, interesting.
And they came up with a new policy that talked a little bit differently about laneway suites and laneway housing, which is better. It's still, I still object to it, but it's better than what it was. And then they came up with the garden suite notion, and which is, again, I wasn't asked to be on the commissions or the committees that deal with them. I understand why. But you have to sometimes agree to a standard that's not perfect in order for you to promote that standard over the period of time. And because of that, I think we've got a few more laneway suites. I still don't think there's the traction that
they were anticipating.
They were anticipating.
No.
There's, we've got hundreds of thousands of opportunities for that.
Yeah.
It is just expensive.
Yes.
And, the building codes have changed to allow secondary suites in dwelling units. I don't know how that's going to fall out, but the codes are trying to evolve. They're trying to evolve to be more usable so that we can get more people living in the city. And hopefully, if we have more places to live, then rents can sort of stabilize a bit more as opposed to going up every single year. But that was really a great thing. I also learned that there's a lot of perception that people throw numbers at the building code without really knowing the genesis of those numbers,
Mm-hmm.
or simply fear mongering to say we got to be within or else you'll lose the building.
Right.
The important thing should be life safety. Get the people out. Building burns to the ground. It's a small house. Rebuild it.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's the decision you make when you decide not to put in sprinklers in a building. And I would suggest that almost 100% of the houses are not sprinkled. Condominiums are, because they're a little bit more difficult and challenging to put out a fire. But I think statistically speaking, from the fire loss, you're more likely to die in a house fire than you are in a condo fire.
You say this, and I think to myself, I know that there's an associated cost with installing these units and a general upkeep cost with installing these units, testing, etc., to ensure that everything works. But the value of having something like that in new construction, something I'm taking away from this, at least just to have a conversation with people.
I think it's a conversation worth, and I know that, if we were to say, let's sprinkler all our buildings, that would be great. We could then save some money on fire departments because we wouldn't need them as much.
Right.
But we're still going to have non-sprinklered buildings. We're still going to have, the secondary need for fire department, which are, accidents and stuff like that. So they still will play a vital role. But I think part of the dilemma of sprinklering a house is if you go to, the family and say, you've got $5,000. Do you want marble countertops or do you want a sprinkler system? I suspect most people are going to fall towards those marble or granite countertops.
It's interesting because I was immediately moving toward the other, but that's me, and I'm not.
Yeah,
I guess I'm not the demographic.
There's not a lot of people that I know that have a sprinklered house.
Yeah. You know why? I think also largely because it's not even something that's really brought up as a discussion point through the course of the planning.
No, and I think that some of the custom homes that I've worked on, we do end up sprinklering because of some idiosyncrasies in the building code.
Right.
Where you sprinkler it like these Iceberg houses that have 2 basement levels.
Yes.
You end up having to have that discussion. And do you extend that sprinkler system to the upper floors? And I think part of the reason people don't want sprinklers is because they have the perception that when one sprinkler head goes, they're all going off. And that's not the case. You have one sprinkler head goes off, it's usually going off for a reason, because there's a fire. You won't get all those other sprinkler heads going off.
Yeah, we have built a number of homes, 2-3 homes that have suppression systems throughout areas of the home, especially mechanical rooms.
Mechanical rooms, if you've got a parking garage where you've got 18 of your favorite Lamborghinis parked, you might want to think about that.
Yes.
Too.
The water might not hurt a Lamborghini Moria, but the fire might. Yeah,
fire might do a pretty good job, and sprinklers will do a good job in making sure it doesn't spread.
Yeah.
On the flip side, if you've got expensive art, you have to be mindful about, your art's going to be destroyed or significantly destroyed if there's a fire. So you have to sort of think about all those things, and the sprinkler standards are pretty relaxed in the design for houses. So you don't have to put them in closets, and certain bathrooms, you don't need them, certain size bathrooms.
Right.
So there is a reason to consider it if you're building a new house. It's just that a lot of people don't think about that.
Yeah. I want to ask, you had said, I think prior to our clicking record, that you're looking to, slowly wind down your practice. Is that an active thing, or is that something that you have in the back of your mind?
Oh, no, it's active. I've
Okay.
been trying to retire since 2020.
Okay.
I had an employee who worked for me for 10 years. When she learned that I was going to retire in 2020, she said, I think I'll leave you in 2020. And I said, that's a great idea. Here's my files and the files that you've been working on. You take over them. So it wasn't a hostile leaving. It was like, please, Nicole, take these files. And that way my clients that have been, fabulous to me for the last 30 years don't see a change. And that, right. Nicole, you will always have access to me and my files so that you can provide the services that our clients have grown to expect, versus sometimes when an employee leaves, it's like they're dead.
Right.
And I didn't want that. If it meant my practice winding down even faster, that's fine, because it's not about me. It's about my clients and them being serviced properly.
Right. And I say all of this because I do think that there'd be value in having anyone that's interested connect. I not necessarily at this point, maybe with you, but maybe. So I will say this, that if you're listening and you're having interested in connecting with David, feel free to email me. I'm happy to connect you with him. You can also find him online. I'm saying all of this because if you have found an iota of what we have discussed on this immersive conversation interesting, I know that I have. And I think there would be a huge, huge value both to your practice, if you're looking to construct and you're a potential client looking to build, understanding who you're hiring, and if they have a consultant such as David on board would definitely help in the overall process of getting your application approved. We would definitely value someone like you at Walden. And so I have to say with sincere gratitude that I'm happy that Michael Taylor, you made this introduction. It was a pleasure to have you on here. There's I think more to be able to discuss on this, and I thank you. I do. I'm like trying to find other words to like wrap this up, but I've really found this so interesting.
Thank you. I'm humbled. I think that we all think our jobs are pretty mundane and boring, and engineers don't have a great reputation for being exciting. But I think that engineers have an ability to be a great asset to any architectural firm. Mechanical, electrical, structural. They just need to, I think everybody just needs to think a little differently.
Yeah.
Open up your mind. Think of the world not as linear. Again, I'll leave you with the question of when does a wall become a roof and when does a roof become a wall? And that can sometimes change how tall your building is or what you do in that space. Or can you use a wall as a floor? We think floors are designed to walk on. That's your perception, right? But if you can turn a floor 90 degrees, and then you have a room with a high ceiling, that floor that is now vertical can be potentially interactive with the floor below. There's lots of things you can do in the building code. And I get all excited when I start thinking about it.
As you said this, I just started thinking of that scene in Inception where they're rotating. and the walls become the ceiling, and the ceiling becomes the walls, and the floor becomes the ceiling, and it just starts rotating. Yeah.
We have these things in our mind that restrict how we think about certain things. Mm-hmm. Like another example is your property line. When you have when you buy a chunk of land, your perception is that line goes vertically up to infinity, right? I get that. But if you can make an arrangement with somebody that, after 30 feet, it jogs horizontally again, you can do some weird things with the building code. And so I think we have a lot of fixed images in our mind as to what you can do and what you can't do.
Yes.
And I'm coming back to my discussion with Greg Woods in the bar, is that the alcohol allowed us to think a little bit differently. And if you can think of things a little bit differently, there's a great amount of architecture you can do, and there's a great amount of things that you can build that are exciting and interactive and make you feel like that space was designed just for you. And we've got some excellent architects in the world that are trying to do that.
Yeah, thank you.
I'm grateful to be here, and I certainly enjoy listening to your podcasts.